No matter the type of entertainment medium, there are always two things people seem to have the strongest reactions toward: the beginning and the end. And when looking at video games, there's nothing quite like a good final act. Often, this culminates in an epic boss battle against the primary antagonist, and it's this encounter where the player has to use all of their acquired skills and abilities to come out on top and earn that credit roll. But it could be argued that a memorable first encounter can be just as important. This will sometimes see players square off against a foe that isn't a rank and file enemy, and it can be used to give the player a taste of what they can expect from the rest of the game. Often, these fights are instructional, showing players the ropes in a relatively safe environment. The stakes are low, and there is not much progress at risk through experimentation and loss. But even though that may be the case, sometimes these battles can catch the player by surprise, and this shakes them from their assumptions that they had a handle on the various mechanics they've been shown thus far. It's these bosses that we're going to focus on today, those that were encountered towards the start of a playthrough that had something a little special up their sleeves and took first-time players by surprise. So with the caveat that we are well aware that none of these bosses represent anywhere near the maximum challenge offered in their respective games, let's kick things off with Final Fantasy VII's autonomous arachnid, the Guard Scorpion. Final Fantasy VII would end up being a defining game for the PlayStation. Huge amounts of money was spent on marketing the game, and the opening mission was crucial for locking gamers in for what would become a rollercoaster ride. Dubbed the opening bombing mission, it centered around a group of eco-terrorists called Avalanche as they attempted to sabotage a Mako reactor. As players got deeper and deeper inside, they were spurred on by awesome music, stunning backgrounds and compelling gameplay. But the moment that often grounded players was the game's first boss, the Guard Scorpion. Compared to every previous encounter, the Guard Scorpion was on another level, and given its entrance, players were warned to expect a step up in terms of difficulty. The visuals were also intimidating, as the Guard Scorpion was a giant robot with a devilish tail. In reality, the Guard Scorpion's bark would be worse than its bite. Many of its attacks were nothing to write home about, and the encounter itself served as a tutorial to the game's active time battle system. But there was one element that could catch players by surprise. Throughout the battle, the Guard Scorpion would switch to a counter stance. This would see its tail become raised, and if attacked in this state, it would counter with Tail Laser. To prepare players and ensure they avoided eating this powerful attack, Barrett would try to warn them. But due to the translation being a bit misleading, instead of teaching the player to wait until it lowered its tail, Barrett's English translation instead said, "Attack while its tail's up, it's gonna counter with its laser." This suggested that attacking while the Guard Scorpion's tail was up was the correct thing to do. Thus, those who followed Barrett's advice to the letter and continued to do so could have encountered an unnecessary game over. Now, we know what you're thinking. We literally just mentioned the opening boss from Final Fantasy VII, but as the Final Fantasy VII Remake went beyond just being a simple upgrade, it felt remiss not to include it as well. The original Guard Scorpion was only difficult due to confusion surrounding its core mechanic. But for the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the development team wanted to show off their new dynamic battle system and made the renamed Scorpion Sentinel pose a more substantial threat. Featuring an expanded moveset, the Scorpion Sentinel could use a number of attacks to cause the player trouble. Some would even be unblockable, while others would cause knockback. The Deadly Tail Laser also returned. This time, it was a big set-piece move. It would force the player to take shelter behind fallen debris to avoid sustained damage and annihilation. In spite of this, as the first boss, the Scorpion Sentinel was designed to ease players into the game's mechanics. During parts of the fight, this meant the player was encouraged to switch between Cloud and Barrett to build stagger and render the mechanical monstrosity vulnerable to attacks. What's impressive, however, is how much Square Enix managed to take a familiar enemy and crank it up a notch. And it meant the Scorpion Sentinel delivered a fresh take for old faces and new faces alike. The Guard Scorpion might be the most infamous tutorial boss in this series, but it would be another boss that would be the first to show players the ropes of the ATB system. Final Fantasy IV would be the first time players ever bore witness to the ATB system, and the Mist Dragon would serve to demonstrate the more nuanced things that were possible thanks to this new system. Previously, Final Fantasy and other role-playing games like Dragon Quest were largely turn-based. This new system allowed players to input commands between actions, and it was therefore quite novel. The Mist Dragon was designed to tease players into this new system, rewarding patient players who opted to bide their time and strike when the opportunity presented itself. Now, it would be a mistake to call the Mist Dragon hard, but even though it should have been a straightforward encounter, the developers made sure this boss had some bite behind the bark. Similar to the Guard Scorpion's counter stance, the Mist Dragon had a state in which it became a cloud of mist. If attacked in this form, it would counter with the Cold Mist ability, a powerful attack capable of wiping the party, or at the very least bringing them close enough to death that a subsequent attack could finish them off. It meant paying attention to its form would be the key to victory here, and this little mechanic, as well as the active aspect of combat, was sure to have thrown a few players off. Final Fantasy Tactics was infamous for posing a tough challenge to players with its strategy-based gameplay, and its pocket-sized follow-up, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, was no slouch in this regard either. Tactics Advance would add many new features to the world of Ivalice, some of which would go on to become mainstays such as new races like the Bangar and Viera, and of course, the Judges. Also introduced in Tactics Advance were the Totema, which were based on the Lucavi. One of the new ones, Famfrit, the Totema of the Mughals, was fought as the first story boss encounter. But unlike some of the other bosses we've featured so far, this was not a tutorial boss, and players needed to be prepared. Famfrit appeared alongside two pairs of Ahriman and Fotai enemies. These had to be dispatched quickly due to one of the enemies possessing the Roulette ability, which had the chance of instantly KOing a participant in the battle regardless of party affiliation. Once these enemies were dispatched, the player could then focus on Famfrit. But even without its minions, the player would need to be wary, as Famfrit packed an assortment of abilities that could turn the fight ugly very quickly. To kick things off, Famfrit was a big fan of the slow status, reducing the number of turns the player had. This would be then complemented by Demi, which would reduce a character's health by half. Famfrit could also attack through any reaction abilities the player had equipped with its light speed attack. It could also knock units away with presence and use its Breath of God ability to attack surrounding units. Beyond this, Famfrit also possessed the counter ability, and combined with the annoyance of the add-ons, it's safe to say that it really let players know what Final Fantasy Tactics was all about. If there's one thing Final Fantasy has become known for, it's the allusions and self-referencing materials found in each game. And one game that has embraced perhaps more of this than any other in the franchise is Final Fantasy XIV. When Endwalker was released in late 2021, it was hinted through promotional material that there would be a heavy focus on references to Final Fantasy IV, with locations such as the moon being featured in prominent fashion. To this end, it was a delight to many players that the first explorable dungeon of the expansion was the Tower of Zot, with its first bosses being none other than the Magus Sisters. As the first bosses fought in Endwalker, the Magus Sisters took the role of setting the tone for the remainder of the expansion, and they did this by introducing players to the kinds of mechanics and gameplay they could expect from there on out. Each using their own fast-paced area of effect attacks, the Magus Sisters worked in tandem and needed to be focused down one at a time if the player wished their party to be victorious. The biggest surprise the Magus Sisters had in store was their Delta attack, which would take on the form of either a blizzard, thunder, or fire elemental magic attack. Each of these variations had its own effects and mechanics, but the effects were compounded by a few factors, making them even more difficult to dodge. When Delta Attack was cast, another spell called Mansuya Faith would be cast. This would power up the move, adding more attacks for the player to dodge. At the same time, they would also buff it by casting Manusia Reflect, which would cause the Delta Attack spell to fire from all three sisters, causing maximum chaos. To mitigate this, it will be essential to take out one of the sisters first, because without doing this, it will be hard to stay ahead of the magical onslaught, making this dungeon boss a real wake-up call for casual players and parties without a plan. As an action role-playing game on the PlayStation Portable, Crisis Core took familiar elements and enemies from the world of Final Fantasy VII and brought them into a fully 3D, fast-paced, real-time action setting. Players would also be placed in control of only a single protagonist, Zack, and this meant they had to learn all new ways of taking down a litany of familiar foes, one of which was the Behemoth. Notorious amongst Final Fantasy fans, the Behemoth is often encountered much closer to the end of a typical Final Fantasy game, but in Crisis Core, the developers decided to move away from that design element by having it appear as the first boss. The Behemoth will be fought after the opening moments of the game inside one of Shinra's combat simulators, and as expected, it hit hard and fast. Attacks like Heave, if not avoided, could cause heavy damage, and its powerful spin attack, Gyro Tail, had the potential to catch players by surprise. Crisis Core would go on to feature much harder examples of the Behemoth enemy type, such as the Sea Hulk variant, but as a first boss, This behemoth really set the stage for what the rest of the game had to offer, pushing the player to think on their feet, learn how to use the unique control scheme, and be aware of their position on the battlefield in relation to their enemy. That then brings us onto the final entry for today. And what else could it have been but the first boss from Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins? Chaos Advent. Fans of Nioh may have had an idea what was in store when they booted up Stranger of Paradise, but it's fair to say that the technical skill required out of the gate would have been quite surprising to those who were used to the more traditional turn-based Final Fantasy games. Featuring tough-as-nails combat, Stranger of Paradise leaned in heavily on its genre inspiration, meaning its first boss, Chaos Advent, served as a bit of a skill check for newcomers. The fight against Chaos Advent would be fought in 2 phases. Each one would keep the player on their toes through a combination of powerful physical attacks and magical attacks, and during the second phase, this is where the real challenge would come. Chaos Advent would use Ice Sword, unleashing devilish combos and the powerful Blizzaga ability, causing damage to a wide area of effect. Fiery Hold would also cause significant trouble, as it was unblockable and could cause a massive amount of damage. Numerous strategies could be employed to defeat Chaos Advent, but the majority would require strong timing and patience, and this would almost definitively serve as one of the toughest first bosses ever faced when looking at the whole franchise. And that, as they say, is that. They were 7 of the toughest first bosses you might have encountered across the Final Fantasy franchise. Were there any we didn't mention that gave you a run for your money that you weren't expecting? Please share in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Galson Dikujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Sukan TDK, your super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.